Take it outside.
It's my only way to go.
Hi, everybody.
All right, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for your patience, Mr. Scheffler. We're back, House Government Operations and Military Affairs Committee on this Wednesday, February 15th. Our next witness to talk about aspects of our miscellaneous elections bill is the chair of the Franklin County Democratic Party to tell us a little bit about the last primary. And I want to welcome Zach Scheffler to the committee.
Chair McCarthy, members of the committee, thanks for having me and thanks for your time and your deliberation on this issue. I really appreciate it. I just wanted to come to speak with you about my personal experience, what I saw, what I felt, and what I was hearing during our most recent primary elections in August of 2022. Speaking specifically of what I understand is DR 23075, Sections 1, sore loser laws, and Section 6. Cross nominations. I hope that this testimony today serves as a tangible example of a system that allows for cross nominations and might lack some provisions around or related to so-called loser laws. I think I'd hope to stress, from my experience, the need for a more representative primary process, the need for increased integrity in party nominations. And just overall, the need for more clarity in our electoral process as we, work to increase civic engagement in Vermont. I believe there's a compelling state interest for all of these things, and I think that combined with something I'm grateful for, an open primary system, something that gives Vermonters and voters a flexibility to do what a lot of folks I talk to up here like to do, which is vote for the person, not just the party. These things combined, I think make for a more representative system. Moving along to bring you back and to summarize a bit of what was going on in August of 2022, particularly as it relates to one of our county-wide elections, the county sheriff's election. So some facts to put forth for your consideration as you move forward to your discussions about the text of the bill. John Grissmore ran for Franklin County Sheriff. It's a county-wide office. Speaking personally of my experience with the Democratic primary nominations process, just wanted to bring to the committee a fact that Grissmore won with less than 250 votes out of what I believe is nearly 4,500 Democratic ballots cast by Democratic voters in the Democratic Party nominations during the primary of August of 2022. So again, less than 250 votes out of nearly 4,500 cast. Just days after the primary, a video was released, and this video showed John Grissmore assaulting a detainee at the Franklin County Sheriff's Office. Following that video's release, both the Franklin County Democrats and the Franklin County Republican parties called for Grissmore to step down and to decline party nominations. In our case, this would have allowed our committee to nominate a replacement and fill the vacancy that Grissmore would have left had he declined and stepped down ahead of our general election later that year. But Grissmore declined. Given that fact, and because he refused to decline, he was not only printed on the ballot, but the number of votes that he won with, again, 250 votes or less than out of 4,500 Democratic ballots cast, meant that this small number of write-in votes allowed him to appear on as a Democrat on the ballot. And it allowed him to have this Republican Democratic nominee status with R and D next to his name. And I just want to share with the committee that what I found was that this implied that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party supported this nominee and backed him and his appearance on the ballot. To a personal point, and I just want to share, and I can only hope to impart, the incredible amount of confusion that this caused among primary voters and carried through into the general election. An immense amount of confusion, lack of clarity around how this came to happen. An amount of confusion that demanded a lot of explanation, not only in the press, but personal conversations I had with fellow party members about how John Grissmore secured the Democratic nomination with so few votes, an amount of votes that wasn't representative in any way, considering that so the small percentage that that earned him and secured him this nomination. It was incredibly fraught. It was incredibly difficult. It was incredibly confusing, and comments about the lack of clarity were many. For me, I would support any action that the legislature could take to increase the integrity of party nominations. And when I say integrity, I mean any steps that we can reasonably take, partnered with our open primary system, to reduce things that have been discussed at an incredibly high level in this country. I was reading a bit about Storer v. Brown, Supreme Court, and reading a bit into a paper published by the Congressional Research Service regarding sore-loser laws and other ballot access issues and ballot nomination issues. And increasing integrity means that we would have less inter-party rating in the nominations process, and also just reduce intra-party feuding ahead of a general election. I would support any action you could take, and I thank you so much for considering this. I think it's reasonable to ask folks running for office in a party primary, given that they're open, to pick a lane, choose which party to run under, or if they choose, run under no party and run as an independent. I think that Vermont system, with these added provisions, would be incredibly strong and helpful as we move to increase civic engagement, increase clarity, and reduce the level of confusion on the ballot as it's put forth and as it's given to voters. And again, just to reiterate, this primary process in August of 2022 was, it was deeply upsetting to members of the party. It was deeply upsetting to voters in general. And the amount of press, the amount of personal conversations, the amount of intra-party conversations, the amount of deliberations that we had to go through, and I had to work with my partner across the aisle here in the county, at the county committee level, the county certification level. It was a lot. I don't know if it was helpful. I would argue that it was. And so thinking about the text that y'all are studying today and that you're working through today and in the weeks and months ahead, I'd be interested and highly support any measures that y'all could take around sore-loser laws and to clarify this cross-nominations process.
Zach,
that's really all I have to say for now, but I'd open it up to any questions. Chair McCarthy.
Did it feel like an insurmountable challenge to have a candidate who, out of 4,500 roughly Democratic ballots cast countywide, got a couple hundred votes, to have them holding the Democratic nomination for you to get the call? What was it like to answer the calls from people who were asking you, why did the Democratic Party endorse this guy?
Right. What was the particular word you used?
Well, so
Insurmountable.
Yeah, did it feel insurmountable to like endorse a writing candidate and then try to make that happen? Like the process that we went through, and that you were at the kind of the center of a storm along with the chair of the Franklin County Republicans trying to support a writing candidate. Did the fact that there were both of those nominations on the ballot create kind of an insurmountable challenge for you?
I would say the amount of energy that it took to clarify in these conversations that I've had, and also just go through the current process to, find a write-in really around an alternative candidate for folks to give people an option that I felt was more representative of the party. It was highly. It was troubling I don't know if I would use the word insurmountable, but the amount of energy that it took to do any of this, to rally folks behind and inform voters, to give them a choice and give them options, it was incredibly tough. I would use the words incredibly, incredibly tough.
Thanks. Representative Hango.
So I hear what you're saying, and I lived this because I'm in Franklin County and I was also a candidate on the ballot and also a voter. So I don't understand what removing a party label on the ballot would have changed about this particular election. To me, it was really a name recognition. It was not a party affiliation that got this individual elected, duly elected, may I add. Whether I'm for or against the election of this individual and what party I belong to has no bearing for me on this situation at all. So could you further explain how removing a party label would be beneficial in a situation like this, should it ever come up again?
Yeah, I think back to, again, those personal conversations I had to have with folks across the county, Democratic voters across the county, who would have specifically pointed to the lack of representation they felt in that the floor was so low, the line was so low for a candidate to secure the nomination. Again, I would just point to, for the committee's deliberation, the fact that in the county we had 4,500 Democratic voters casting ballots that did not vote for Gristmore, or I should say 4,500 ballots that were cast, only 237 of which wrote in a particular candidate's name, and that secured the nomination for the party. I guess I would just point to the fact that there was that's a representation issue, and I don't feel that Democratic voters in the primary process, the party primary process, felt particularly represented. And looking at the numbers, I would say that that kind of solidified their opinion that it wasn't a representative system, and that something needs to change.
Zach, would you say that voters who saw the Republican/Democratic nomination that of the one name printed on the ballot, that many of them were probably assuming that both of those parties were supporting those candidates, maybe had missed your press release and Chair Luno's press release?
Yeah, that goes back to my point about clarity. There was a lack of clarity. There was confusion around, the party labels appearing on the ballot and the impression that voters were given by that. So yeah, just pointing again to lack of clarity and the amount of confusion that it created in what I imagine might be both parties had the situation been reversed was quite a bit. It was notable. It was very significant.
I'm
sorry, if you want to follow up.
Yeah, I'm not quite done with that. I don't think you really answered my question, unfortunately, about how removing a party label would establish clarity. In my opinion, that would perhaps muddy the waters even further, because people who are, for instance, staunchly Republican or staunchly Democrat would then question, okay, we've elected somebody, what party do they belong to? Even though maybe a sheriff shouldn't belong to a public or a political party, but that's another conversation totally. So how would removing a party label establish clarity?
Could you rephrase the clarification?
Can I try to capture what I think you're getting at, Representative Hango, and you can tell me if I'm. I don't want to put any words in your mouth, but I'll try to ask it in a way that I think would be helpful. So, what does it mean to a voter when they see the party next to the candidate's name?
That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, what does it mean to a voter if they see no party? What advantage is that? What are you trying to accomplish by removing party labels?
I would just point again to something that Franklin County voters express to me often, which is, it's about the many voters vote for the person and not the party. So I guess I would just say that putting candidates on the ballot who are clearly and with significant intent are endorsed by a large number of Democratic or other party voters. I feel like having candidates on the ballot that are clearly supported by their party is important. And I would leave the rest of that discussion as to who to support up to folks and their personal political inclinations, or if they have none, their relation or connection with the person on the ballot.
Thank you. I appreciate that you're representing one particular party's view, but I did want to make it clear to folks who may not have followed the election that both the Republican and the Democratic parties endorsed this candidate prior to the election. So now we're having this
That's actually not the
conversation.
case. That's not the case, actually. So
It's not.
before the election, that candidate for sheriff only appeared on a Republican ballot. And the Democratic Party, in large part because that particular candidate had been endorsed by the sheriff, did not actively recruit. And if I recall that correctly, am I right, Chair Scheffler, that the Democratic Party wasn't really focused on the sheriff's race because those aren't really seen as partisan races. We don't do a lot of activity around the probate judge's race or the sheriff's race typically.
But I understood that before the general election, this person was endorsed by both parties. Am I incorrect, Mr. Scheffler?
To my understanding, in the primary, Grismore ran under the Republican primary ticket, and there was no candidate on the Democratic in the Democratic primary. And I would just to add clarity to the discussion, in the general, Grismore received Republican and Democratic labels because a very, very small number of Democratic primary voters, 237, wrote in John Grismore's name on the Democratic primary ticket. And because of that small number, speaking for a large number of Democratic primary voters, and the lack of representation that some folks felt, Grismore received the Democratic nomination. But to your point specifically, Grismore ran on the Republican ticket in the primary. He did not run on the ticket printed on the Democratic primary ballot in the Democratic primary. He received write-in votes.
So I've got a bunch of hands up. So Representative Nugent was first, Chase, and then Byron.
So I appreciate what you're saying. I think this has clarified for me some of the, like where the issue is. And I guess I wanted to say something and then see if this is correct. So when a voter goes to the polls, they're looking at the name and the party. And I think, I'm not sure every voter in Vermont or every Vermont voter sees it one way or the other, that this would be an endorsement from the party. Because in this state, the people who are voting decide for themselves if they're Democrats or if they're going to vote on the Democratic ballot, and they also are the ones who are deciding who gets that Democratic nomination. So it's very like people driven, rather than the party saying like, here's who we're putting on the ballot, which, you know, I think it could go both ways. I think in history, parties have decided and then done that. They put that on the ballot. And we just have a very like much more bottom up process from what I'm this is really crystallizing that for me. And I guess, is there another way to handle this confusion, which would be educating the public about that? Like when you go into the voting booth, you're acting as a member of the ballot that you're participating in to nominate your party's candidate, rather than trying to do it like ahead of time or do it this.
Is there a specific question I can? That seems like a deliberative question. I would be happy to give that to the committee to discuss. Unless there's a specific question embedded in there, I'd be happy to answer it.
I guess just, am I getting that right?
I think maybe what Representative Nugent's trying to get at, Zach, is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the tension between the fact that we have open primaries And then once we get to the point where the primary is over, that party label that's on the general election ballot, it means different things to different voters, because some voters are really aware of how open our primaries are and what that means. And a lot of voters, I think, assume, and was it your experience, Zach, that a lot of voters who saw that the Democratic label was going to be next to that Franklin County Sheriff candidate's name, along with the Republican one, assumed that the Democratic Party, like you as the chair, for instance, were supporting that candidate?
Yeah, I would say that the fact that 237 out of 4,500 folks provided this nomination, and then therefore, this candidate appeared with our party's label next to it, signaled to the majority of people that the party, as an organization, as an entity, as a political body, endorsed that candidate, when the reality of it was that the result was not indicative, reflective, or representative of the party's wishes or intent.
Representative Chase.
Thanks. Would it be accurate to say the way things played out basically caused those write-ins to lock up the label so that you couldn't put anybody else on the ballot even after the primary?
I would say that using the words "locked up," it secured this particular candidate the nomination. Yes, and it forced us to, given that the candidate did not decline or step down from receiving that nomination, it forced us to mount, a separate. It required us to mount additional measures in order to, work on behalf of the voters to give them other options on the ballot. Yes.
Okay. And if I understand it correctly, the proposals put forth in this draft would have left that position open so that you could easily put somebody on the ballot with that label to provide the alternate choice. Is that accurate?
I believe that the provisions in the text would have helped clarify our nominations process and make it clear to Democratic voters that, Grissmore may have in fact not garnered the support of the majority or even the majority of the Democratic Party and party voters.
Thank you.
All right. One last question. Representative Byron.
Yeah, this is more of a thought bubble, but I'll position it towards the county chair. Has there been any discussions on the possibility of a provision saying that a major party would reserve the right or have the opportunity to reject a write-in candidate if they didn't feel, I'm kind of building off of the name conversation, vetting.
I have not asked Zach to prepare for that question.
Or just throwing it out there, right? If you have somebody who comes in on this write-in side and they don't represent, one of the party's ideological vein, policy vein, functional approach to the role they may play. I'm just thinking, is there, again, thought bubble?
Yeah, I think, we should have this discussion as a committee about, are there other ways that we could accomplish there being this clarity? That's kind of what we're getting at, but there's probably a lot of different ways to skin that cat. I think the tension that we run into there, Representative Byron, is between the voters of Vermont, I think, want the ability to have these open primaries, and Zach was getting at that he's not testifying against us having open primaries. I think Vermont voters, in my experience, really want to be able to, grab the party ballot where their candidates are to boost to the person that they want to get that particular party's nomination in a given year. But then on the flip side of that, there isn't really any check for a party other than just putting out a press release to say hey, this person who got our nomination isn't really the person we endorse. We'd rather you vote for somebody from the other party or write in a candidate. In this particular instance, I think Zach summed up pretty well what the consequences were, but that's another idea that I think is worth putting on the table. Zach, we've kept you way over time. Representative Hooper has one last question.
Zach, for the sake of personal clarity, in 2 sentences or fewer, could you articulate your ask of the committee today?
I would simply ask y'all to consider the text and understand that it would be very helpful to party members as we look to boost engagement in the county.
Well, I guess, are you asking for a removal of party affiliation sheriff's candidates? Is that one of your requests? Or is that not?
No, I wouldn't clarify. I wouldn't characterize that as my request. I would simply say that the text as written in sections 1 and 6, I think is great work. I would ask you all to continue along this line of thought to provide clarity as to, well, to give parties the mechanisms in place to clarify candidates on this ballot.
Thanks for being with us today, Zach. I really, really appreciate your time.
Hey, I appreciate yours, and thank you for considering this. Thank you for working through this. I just appreciate all your work, and I really hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day.
Take care.
You too.
Adios.
All right, next up, I really appreciate Liz Medina from the AFL-CIO has asked for some time to testify about our elections bill, and I appreciate your patience. Our scheduling today has been a bit of an accordion.
No worries.
It sometimes happens.
Absolutely. And I appreciate having some time here today. So for those folks who may not have seen me as much around the State House, I do spend a lot of time, visiting member workplaces and local union halls. So my name is Liz Medina, and I am the Executive Director of the Vermont State Labor Council, AFL-CIO, which is our state's largest federation of labor unions, and we represent over 13,500 members in this state. We're a growing labor federation thanks to some amazing organizing, AFT and ASME and other affiliate parent unions and locals. And with all due respect to the previous witness, I really am not seeing a problem. What I hear is that the party may have to communicate more with voters if there's confusion. And from my organizing perspective, that's a very good thing. So I want to put a pin on that and encourage people to think about that as well. And I'm going to speak some really hard, honest truths about where our members are at. And I hope you can listen to them and appreciate them for what they are and what voters are feeling these days, at least among working Vermonters. And a lot of our members feel alienated, frankly, by most political parties, especially the 2 traditional parties. And we struck out on a new vision for the labor movement in 2019 to really try to find our own political path forward and a new vision for the labor movement. I, in full disclosure, was part of a reform slate in 2019 called United. And we ran on a 10-point program, which was officially adopted when our slate won in 2019. And one of those points is a new orientation toward electoral politics that reflects where our members are at. And at this convention where we were elected, it was one of our most well-attended convention that we've had in decades. We had over 100 delegates there, and we won overwhelming support for every single seat of our executive board of our labor council. And party politics was a big component in that, and one of the biggest debates we had. We really want to see autonomy from political parties, and that is one of the points of our program, number 6. And what's important to us more than party affiliation is what a candidate is willing to do for working people. And we see the fusion candidate process as one way that helps us as union members understand better and with full transparency and clarity where exactly a candidate may stand within that 2-party system, because these are big tent parties and there's a lot of difference within each of them. And we really need to know where these candidates stand. And I think, with the struggle in this country to have viable third parties, the fusion process is really one of the best options we have for parties and candidates that don't have a lot of resources to signal to our members and other working Vermonters exactly where they stand. And so I find that particular provision of the election reforms to be problematic. And I, just heard about this yesterday, and I called some of our leaders and board members about it, and they were equally perplexed. Katie Harris of ASME 1674, Howard Center, secretary of that local, really doesn't understand why this is even a proposal, because she does not see this as helping her members understand who they should vote for and endorse. So with that, I will say, I think it's solving a problem that doesn't exist and can only probably create more problems. I would also say, as a working class organization, I find it concerning that we are putting more money in politics, and particularly allowing candidates to give unlimited contributions to political parties. I don't see how this can do anything other than entrench existing social and economic inequalities in politics and in this state. We need to, as my colleagues yesterday so eloquently stated, really try to do more to take money out of politics and look into public financing of campaigns and campaign finance reform. So I can just say that I know that our base is not going to be supportive of anything that makes it harder for them to have alternative party endorsements or candidates, or more information on candidates that requires the parties to maybe not work with voters when there is confusion and actually organize and talk to voters. So thank you. That's all I'll say.
Liz, are you open? Did you want to end your testimony, or are you open to questions?
I'm open to questions. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Folks,
yes.
Clarification, and I just wanted to ask that I really take to heart the call that you made in the beginning of your testimony to make sure that candidates reach out and are not just trying to work inside of one party. I think what you were getting at was that the sort of, you called it the fusion system. I would say that the ability to run under two parties, it sends a signal. It's a communication, right? And I'm wondering if that is it really necessary to communicate that sort of affiliation or feeling of having shared values with two or multiple parties needs to be done on the ballot, or whether this is about candidates, organizations, labor unions, et cetera, that are involved in our democracy communicating better. So it's like the thing we're looking at is that specific issue of what is the state's responsibility in our managing of primary elections and our publishing of the nominations on our general election ballots to facilitate multiple party nominations. And is that a virtue or not? That's really the question that we've put on the table.
It's yes to both. I think they need to see that. That's part of communication, having it on the ballot, and also the parties need to communicate as well. I know that a lot of our members would not even probably participate if they didn't see that there were some kind of fusion candidates, because they're so alienated from the traditional two parties.
Any further questions for Liz? Representative Hooper.
Hi. What do you think your organization's role is in doing what you think the party should be doing in terms of differentiating between fusion? You've historically put out a scorecard of how people who are in office vote on issues that you put forward. You put forward a slate of issues that are important to you. Why is it not incumbent upon your organization to make sure that either by interview or some other fact that you know where they stand, and that conversely your membership knows where they stand?
We do that.
So then why, I don't necessarily see where somebody who sees the absence of a two-letter designation on a ballot would say, I'm not voting That seems rather extreme.
Well, we have a lot of members, and so we may be able to reach some people, but we're not going to be able to reach every single one of them. And so our signaling in support of particular additional third parties or other candidates, only has a certain amount of reach. And I think that additional ballot information is really vital for the broadest base of our membership.
The more we talk about this, Mr. Chair, the more I think that we are crossing a line over into what parties could and should be doing to regulate their own business, and that we are maybe not on the solidest ground regulating it for them by legislation.
Yeah, we'll have time for committee discussion on this, but I would say we've had a variety of witnesses over the last morning and afternoon testify, and I really appreciate you being here, Liz, and offering your perspective that many of the discussions that we've had have gotten us thinking about things that aren't actually in the text of the bill. And I think that's important because there's a lot there. And there are other ways that we might think about addressing some of the concerns that have been brought up. So I would say yes in the conversations, absolutely. I don't think we're getting too far afield in the text of the bill that we're looking at in terms of having this question about what's the state's role and what guardrails do we want to put on our primary system. That's kind of that's squarely in our jurisdiction. But I think you're absolutely right. We've gone down some tangents in terms of what the relationship is between the parties and the state and other important institutions in our democratic process. And these are really important conversations. I take them really seriously. I want all voices to come to the table and tell us, don't do this, yes, do that. Here's another thing to think about. So we've got a lot on the table on this elections discussion, and we'll keep working on aspects of this bill and have more time for committee discussion. I think that our next witness is in the Zoom room probably. So Liz, I'm gonna maybe one last comment from Representative Rowicki, and then we'll let you go. And we have one piece of testimony about something completely different.
Just a quick observation about the diversity within all the various factions here, because you've got a union guy here, the state employees union person here, and still trying to come together.
Yeah. It's a complex, messy thing doing democracy, isn't it?
Very layered.
Very important, though, and I appreciate you giving me some time to share our members' perspective, and I look forward to maybe working together in the future on some election reform that I think would be really impactful. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Liz. So I'm going to put the pause button on our election conversation for now, and we have had a request for testimony about a small piece of the budget proposal related to that falls in our military affairs jurisdiction. And I want to welcome a former member of the House and retired Navy captain, I believe, Al Perry, who's going to be talking to us a little bit about an appropriation request for USS Vermont. So, Mr. Perry, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Mr. Chairman. Shall I go?
Al, thank you so much for being with us. Yeah, please tell us a little bit about this request and about your work with the USS Vermont.
Well, I'm not going to do all the telling. I'm going to give a short introduction of our briefing, and then our president, Gary Freimeyer, will start the presentation, if that's okay.
That sounds great. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you very much for this opportunity to brief the Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs on the work of the Vermont Support Group. Our work is done in support the USS Vermont submarine 792 on behalf of the great state of Vermont. Gary Freimeyer, our president, will begin and finish our presentation. I will come in to do the financial section. Gary will review several examples of our support of our current objectives and summarize our request for state assistance. And thank you again for this opportunity. Now over to Gary Freimeyer.
Thank you, Captain Perry, and good morning, committee members. I'll begin with a quick introduction to our namesake submarine. USS Vermont is a Virginia-class fast attack nuclear submarine. She's longer than a football field with a crew of 135 and an expected lifespan of about 30 plus years. Her primary mission is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, but she also carries up to 37 torpedoes and missiles as well. A commissioning committee, the VCC, was formed in 2018 and eventually grew to 26 members. The Vermont was christened in October of 2018 by Gloria Valdez, former Assistant Deputy Secretary of the Navy in charge of shipbuilding and modernization. Governor Scott provided a rousing keynote speech featuring Vermont's naval history at the event. The state of Vermont appropriated $25,000 in fiscal year 20 with a second $25K in fiscal year 21 to support the commissioning. The VCC felt with COVID affecting so many Vermonters at that time that the state needed the second $25K more than we did, and we turned it back to Vermont. Due to COVID, the USS Vermont was commissioned April 2020 by Captain Charles Phillips with only a subset of the crew aboard. They sounded the ship's bell 19 times as the 19th sub in the Virginia class and played Anchors Away and Sinatra's Moonlight in Vermont on the ship's PA system before celebrating with cake. It certainly wasn't the 5-event ceremony we had planned for the occasion. The USS Vermont Support Group was established in 2020 as a subcommittee to the VCC, the USS Vermont Support Group called VSG. And our role is to take the lead with crew and family support, which will extend for the life of the boat. We held a commemorative commissioning in August of 2021 with special guests Rear Admiral Douglas Perry, Al's son, our new Secretary of the Navy, Carlos Del Toro, who also spoke of the importance of the namesake state in support of their ships. Upon completion of the commissioning event, the VCC dissolved in September of 2021. As planned, the VSG assumed all remaining assets of the VCC to continue our mission. If you could turn to the next page. We're talking about the support group's mission and objectives. So the USS Vermont Support Group is an all-volunteer organization, individuals, associations, and businesses dedicated to supporting the USS Vermont, her officers and crew, and families for the life of the boat. We've identified several objectives. They are to support the morale and well-being of the crew and their families. I'll talk about the Vermont Family Readiness Group, FRG, a little bit later. It's a mutual support organization made up of spouses and family members that becomes particularly active helping each other when their sailors are at sea. To develop a community of support for the crew of the USS Vermont and educate the citizens of Vermont about her role in our nation's defense. To promote lasting relationships between Vermonters and the crew of the US Vermont, and to raise funds to finance programs and events. Now, the last objective is why we're here today, to gain your support for ongoing operations of the VSG. We'll explain a little bit later how we're delivering on these objectives. Also aligning with Governor Scott's initiative to bring younger, skilled workers like sailors to the state, our long-term objectives include exploring ways to attract them with scholarships and certification training in exchange for residency in the state of Vermont. The image on this page is unlikely to ever be seen again, with the Vermont Air National Guard F-35s overflying the USS Vermont while the sailors manned the rails for the commissioning. It was a very proud moment for Vermont. Next page, and I'll turn it back over to Captain Perry.
Thank you, Gary. I'm on page 3 of the presentation, and we'll start with where we were in September of 2021. Our initial status financially was $105,000 in the bank received from the Vermont Commissioning Committee. At that time, we had an outlook during the next 5 years of needing about $100,000 to meet our current objectives. And we wanted to set aside, we wanted to invest $85,000 for long-term objectives, and those just mentioned by Gary. We had at the time no major source of revenue, but we had the carryover enthusiasm from the Vermont Commissioning Committee, and we had been able to raise money for that purpose, the commissioning, but we needed to regroup. And last year, our first full year of operations, and by the way, our fiscal year is the calendar year. We spent last year continuing the program support to the crew and the FRG, and held several public events in Vermont, but at the same time on a planning agenda, we know we needed to review long-term commitments and priorities. As a result, we postponed long-term outlays. We decided to invest a chunk of money for the long term and secure our other resources so that we had operating funds in a secured bank account, a conventional checking account, and also given the inflation situation, we look for some return on cash in the bank with CDs. And we've adopted all of that as part of our strategy. And we also have started a fundraising program. At the bottom of this page, you'll see what I call our uses and sources plan for the current year, 23, and plus the next 4. And I'd like to just briefly review that plan. The left-hand column, as you see, shows our planned expenses with a total of $210,000 over the next, this year and the next 4. And spreading out on the horizontal axis, you'll see our sources of revenue. Starting from the left, donors from our fundraising. The state of Vermont, we're asking for $50,000, a $10,000 annual appropriation. Our own resources of $75,000, $25,000 of which have been invested in the Vermont Community Foundation's long-term fund. And we expect limited help from the United States Navy, but we get that mostly when we bring sailors to Vermont, or when we're doing events on a Navy installation, and they provide transportation and other assistance. The in-kind, we're very pleased and proud of our Vermont partners who provide services and food and other gifts for the crew from time to time. And finally, the sales, very modest. We sell memorabilia and Vermont, USS Vermont caps and shirts when we go to county fairs and other public events. Back to expenses. From the top, our support our direct support is the first several items. That we have a $10,000 budget for permanent gifts to the ship, $40,000 for gifts to the crew. That's including welfare and rec funds and individual awards and gifts from Vermont to our honorary Vermonters. The FRG, which was mentioned, the Family Readiness Group, a very, very important factor in the support of the crew. And our support to the FRG is to support what they're doing, which is a big morale factor for the crew. We provide donations from time to time, and we also collect merchandise and food from Vermont to be provided to their activities. The public events, a good example, last year we had 2 visits from USS Vermont sailors, had several public events, and we will be having public events this year at each of the bases, Groton and Pearl Harbor. Long-term investment of $50,000 comes from our current investment of 25, plus another 25 that we want to get from donors as soon as possible. Public relations, very important to maintain communications between our state and our submarine. And the only other mention is other is contingencies, including what we are now have a contingency of inflation terms of increased costs of things and decreased earnings. So that's our overall plan for the 5 years. We developed this last year. We adopted this plan along with our current year budget in November of 2022. And I'll now turn to the current budget. Our fiscal year is our calendar year, and our fiscal 23 budget is shown here. Total of $63.5 and $5,000 in uses, and a total of 63.5 in revenue. You'll note that most of the revenue is from our own current resources. 25 of that has gone into the investment with Vermont Community Foundation, and the other 27 is being used along with 10 from the state to carry out our ongoing current objective support. This is a challenging year for the USS Vermont, for their crew and their families. They will be changing home port from Groton, Connecticut, where they were built and have been supported for the past 3 years. They're going to Pearl Harbor sometime in the spring. The Vermont Support Group's continuing support is especially important to the crew and to the FRG, Family Readiness Group, during this transition year. This year is the largest expense year of our 5-year plan. Our budget for continuing support for the crew and the families and the 2 large public events. The Vermonters Weekend planned for Groton, Connecticut in April, and a welcoming ceremony at Pearl Harbor. The total of that combination is $37,000. Today, we ask for your support and are counting on your financial assistance. And I'd like to turn back to Gary Freimark.
Thanks, Al. And I'll take the committee through how we're performing against the objectives we previously addressed. So we've been successful, as Al mentioned, bringing our crew members to Vermont on several occasions. Venues they've attended include the State House, the Echo Leahy Center, Norwich University, UVM, stops at Cold Hollow Cider Mill, Cabot, Cheese, Farmers Markets, VFWs, American Legions. And our commander also visited an ailing VSG member in rehab at Norwich. The image on the left is from the welcoming ceremony at Lake Champlain Navy Memorial on the Burlington waterfront last March. The replica of the USS Vermont on the right was carved by Chris Miller from a disused piece of mahogany from the sculpture of the goddess Ceres that resides on the dome of the State House. It's mounted on board the USS Vermont outside the wardroom where the officers take their meals. We've assisted in many efforts to put Vermont symbols on board the boat, which the crew calls Big Sugar in honor of our most famous product. The crew berths are named for Vermont ski resorts. Crew members take their meals in what they've named the Catamount Tavern. The Chief's table was made by Maple Landmark in Middlebury. They have a UVM basketball jersey signed by Coach Becker and A.D. Schulman under plexiglass on one of the tables in the Catamount Tavern, and a Lake Monsters jersey on another. We delivered a maple syrup jug from the second USS Vermont, the battleship BB-20, to the boat on loan from curator David Sheets. It resides on board in a display case in the wardroom next to the sub and a maple syrup jug produced by the Byrne Gallery in Burlington. It's a truly unique gift. It's a blown glass sub that's kind of our riff off the regular ship in a bottle. So we provided posters of Vermont covered bridges to adorn the cabinets of the Catamount Tavern. There's a Burton snowboard that acts as a handrail down the stairs on board the boat, and stickers from all over the Vermont on stairwells. We also partner with the officers in their tradition of recognizing sailors of the quarter by providing laser engraved pieces of hull steel that we acquired from the build of the USS Vermont for each of the winners. There's a picture of one of those on the left. We've also developed, as Al mentioned, a very strong relationship with the FRG during particularly difficult COVID times with their sailors at sea. So we work with them on several of their programs. One of them is the provision of what they call sunshine bags, which are pictured on the right. So each crew member assigned to the Vermont gets a canvas bag with Freedom and Unity on one side and USS Vermont SSN 792 on the other. Inside each bag is a pint of Vermont maple syrup, a Vermont Strong license plate from the DMV, Darn Tough socks, a Vermont flag, and various tastes of Vermont from our partners at the Vermont Specialty Foods Association led by Aaron Seacrest. The bags serve to welcome our new honorary Vermonters and give them some flavors of Vermont. We provide a Vermont teddy bear for each new crew member baby, and by the way, there's a lot of them, and have provided gift cards for household services to support families in need when their spouses are at sea. The VSG also performs the role of Santa Claus for the family holiday parties. So if you could go to the next page. The public events we've held include a welcoming ceremony at Lake Champlain Naval Memorial last March, attended by almost 100 Vermonters. We restarted annual 4th of July crew picnics when COVID subsided, and have had our sailors participate in 4th of July parades in Montpelier and last year in Poultney, as you can see in the picture on the left. On the right is our partner Putney Mountain Winery's tasting room display. Charles Dodge produced the Northern Spy sparkling cider used to christen the USS Vermont by sponsor Gloria Valdez, and enjoys helping us tell the USS Vermont story to all who visit. And that's just one of the success stories. Let me just give you a couple others that are very relevant. One of the more than 24 companies and associations we work with is the Vermont Maple Syrup Makers Association, who through Director Allison Hope, working with the VMSMA board, agreed to have a different Vermont county each year provide 48 pints of the Vermont maple syrup for the sailors. So far, we've had syrup donated by Orange and Lamoille, and this year, Addison and Franklin counties. We wanted to build a bell stand for the USS Vermont where the ship's bell could hang pierside. And we asked the folks at Stafford Technical Center in Rutland for help. And we're both blessed and lucky to find the leader of the welding curriculum there was a former Navy hull technician. Needless to say, they jumped at the opportunity and did an incredible job of building an excellent bell stand for the boat. That kind of connection between the talented kids at Stafford and the boat is priceless. An important way we educate Vermonters about our boat and her role in the Navy is to hold command briefings via Zoom, where the USS Vermont officers have non-confidential updates on the boat's exercise, missions, and accomplishments of our namesake sailors. Last March, the commander of the USS Vermont performed an in-person briefing for submarine track cadets at Norwich University. That's pictured on the left. 3 cadets in the group were committed to the submarine track when the briefing began, and by the end there were 6. The sailors learn a lot about Vermont from the sunshine bags and from stories from the sailors who we've sponsored to come here, which result in crew families choosing to vacation in Vermont. We encourage this, and when we're forewarned about their coming, we alert our supporters and fund generous discounts on Vermont products to show our appreciation of the Vermont sailors and families. That's Chief Holt's family there in the picture on the right. Sailors have particularly enjoyed their visits to 14th Star Brewing Company, Putney Mountain Winery, and Dutton's Farm Stand in Manchester. As Al mentioned, our fundraising got on to a bit of a slow start, but it's maturing now with the Vermont Community Foundation, where we've invested a portion of our VSG's funds for long-term growth. We're in the process now with building campaigns to approach donor-advised funds with VCF's guidance. The next page. And in summary, the Vermont motto is freedom and unity, which was central to remarks by Governor Scott and Representative Welch at the christening and commissioning. As we've adopted the USS Vermont, so has the crew adopted Vermont, as evidenced by their CHAMP shoulder patches, their Green Mountain Strong cheer, and the boat's nickname of Big Sugar, honoring Vermont maple syrup, and the extensive Vermont iconography they've added throughout the boat. We ask for your ongoing support in the form of an annual 10K appropriation to maintain our operations and fulfill Governor Scott's address to the officers and crew of the Vermont. At the christening, he quoted Ethan Allen regarding the Green Mountain Boys' perseverance. Governor Scott said, "The gods of the hill sail with you and will always be with you." So please help us on behalf of all Vermonters to make that enduring support possible.
Thank you, Mr. Freimeyer and Captain Perry, for being with us. That was the most thorough request for a $10,000 appropriation we're bumping up against new meetings. I've already lost a couple of committee members, but just wondering if anybody has any burning questions for Mr. Freimeyer or Captain Perry, Representative Nugent.
This might be a dorky question, but when you said Captain Phillips, is that the Captain Phillips?
No, although we tried to get him to join us at the commissioning. It's a different Captain Phillips.
Different one.
May I respond to the chair's comment? $10,000 is kind of routine and small for you folks. It's a big deal for us.
Well, I imagine that this, I just wanted to clarify for the committee that the $10,000 appropriation for this coming fiscal year is in the governor's recommended budget. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, just wanted that on the record here for our committee too, because I know you've either have been or are going to be across the hall on appropriations. Well, thank you so much for being with us. I wish I had more time to spend talking about the USS Vermont. This has been the most fun part of our morning. Really, really appreciate the work you're doing and the value. Just, I mean, it's wonderful to share Vermont with the folks who are serving on the USS Vermont and all the ways that you do, but inviting them to come here and the tourism benefit and things, I can't imagine a better investment of our resources in terms of supporting your work. So you'll get my vote. We'll talk about this in our appropriations letter, but I really deeply appreciate the work that you're doing to spread the Vermont love through the support of the USS Vermont. So thank you.
Thank you for having us. Go Big Sugar.
Take care.
Oh, Big Sugar.
All right, committee. So we will adjourn and go off live. We'll be back at 1 and we're diving into our real day of testimony on the OPR bill, hoping we can get that testimony in and then